back thrown out, all kind of turned the wrong way.
I don't know how it happened. The odd thing is it came on slowly,
Mm-hmm.
So I have kind of recurring back issues, a recurring injury. And usually when I do it, it's from doing a burpee or get the good morning exercise. But this time it came on slowly, which I think means I just worked out my leg day, pushed myself, which I did, and didn't stretch enough. So I kind of slowly pulled it out. So it was nothing sudden.
Yeah, I know. I've had a couple different back injuries in my life, and I know the feeling. I used to wake up and just turn slightly wrong, and then that would be done for the day. I'd just be like, okay, going back to bed. So I know that feeling. One of the things that helped me out the most was these things that I purchased called moon boots. And basically you strap it to your foot and your ankle, and it kind of supports everything, and then you hook on, and you just like, you start slower, like kind of work your way up, and you kind of just hold yourself, and then you just like give yourself tension so that it can release everything. And that worked wonders for me. Like, so. Yeah.
So I used to have an inversion table, which effectively gets you upside down the same way.
Mm-hmm.
But
those are really uncomfortable, though. I tried one of those.
So rarely.
Not fun.
Yeah.
Because you'd strap it on here, I believe, and then with your weight, it would like hurt.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah.
They're uncomfortable. So that's why I was like, I tried these other ones that worked really well. But I've been through all kinds of horrible back injuries, to compressed discs when I was very young from a snowboarding injury. And I got 10 herniated discs and then 2 severe compressed discs. And so
my back's hurting.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I know the feeling. I have a couple really cool backstories as well. Backstories about my back.
That's funny.
So how was your meeting with you went out to, what was it?
It was in Lake Elsinore. It was good.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was visiting schools in Lake Elsinore,
Mm-hmm.
and I love that. You get to hang out with educators, just cool people, help them do what they're trying to do, and it's fun that I get to do that for a living. Yeah,
that is neat. And then you went out recently, or was it Palm Springs?
Yeah, so that
to
was
an event.
Yeah, the ACSA is the Association of California Superintendents and Administrators.
Mm-hmm.
They had their Every Student Counts Symposium, which is a special ed conference focusing on the students who have different learning disabilities and supporting them, how to support students with diverse needs.
Mm-hmm.
So I like it. Every student counts.
So how many books have you written now?
Books written, just the one.
Just the one?
Yeah.
Okay. I've read that to my daughter now, I think 3 different times.
Cool.
And I think it's one of those books that translates across a broad range of ages. Because like for her, like I have to explain a couple things to her. But overall, like once I explain it, she gets it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And of course it can like range from, anywhere, I'm guessing, correct me if I'm wrong, from like 8 to 15, like somewhere in that range.
Yeah, the target we were shooting for.
Yeah, perfect. So I definitely get that. I mean, it could go above and beyond that age if need be, but I'm guessing that's kind of like the target market. But
yeah, it's really interesting talking about that book with people.
Mm-hmm.
Are we recording, by the way?
Oh yeah, we started.
Cool. What's interesting with that book is people either get it or they don't.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm talking mostly adults. And so who's dealt with anxiety because they get it and it resonates with them, or they just don't get it. And it seems like it's nothing in between. There's no middle ground like, oh yeah, I can see, I understand it. It's rave about it, cry, tear up about it, or just don't get it.
Yeah. No, there was a couple of things that didn't necessarily resonate with Erilyn, but then when I reconfigured it into like a situational thing with her, like at school or somebody else, it like clicked right away. And she's like, oh yeah, I haven't necessarily experienced that, but
I can see it.
I can see it like with somebody else who like was going through that, and like I completely understand it. So that's the great thing about starting young, even though they're not necessarily like comprehending it all.
Yeah.
being able to explain those type of like situational experiences and then teaching them ahead of time so that they can understand them when they get into that type of situation, and or recognize that kind of stuff with other kids their age so that they can provide that comfort level or explain what they need to.
Yeah.
You know?
That's precisely the key, is knowing ahead of time, having the vocabulary to address it as it comes up. 50% of anxiety can be relieved just by being able to describe what it is you're feeling. And so if you have the vocabulary to talk about, I'm feeling terrified of this test or whatever it is, by just being able to verbalize it, you can relieve approximately 50% of anxiety. So having that vocabulary ahead of time is key.
Yeah, I mean, I try and do that with Erilyn all the time. Just even when she's going through something emotional, I'm like, you have to like get it out, like talk to me about it, but you also have to specify exactly what it is that you're feeling, because it like sometimes I've noticed with a lot of people, and it doesn't have to necessarily be kids, they're just like, I feel weird. And you're like, what is weird? You know, that's like such a broad range of like energy spectrum.
Right.
And it's like, you need to be like, I'm feeling this. And then once like somebody starts describing it, they start kind of whittling down to that core. And then you almost like energetically see them internally whittling it down. And when they get to that inner part, like you start seeing the emotions, and like you can see in their eyes, you know, like when they start tearing up or whatever, because they start like working down what it is that they're feeling by using either those inner words that they may have for themselves or the external words that they may not have developed yet. But when you, like as a hypnotherapist, what I've done with people is like you allow them to recognize what it is internally that they need to strategically focus on, so that it doesn't have to necessarily be expressive, but when you can see their eye movement and start thinking about it, and then they get to the point and you see them like watering up, you know that they've started figuring that out internally, what they're feeling, and then they can get to that point to express it better, and then you can be like, okay, that's what you're feeling, now how can I help you? You know.
And if you can get them to express it or help them arrive at understanding it, quite often the answers present themselves to them, and that's tremendously empowering.
Yeah, sometimes you don't have to say anything, like you just like, what do you need to, like, what is it that you need to like work out, and then like after a couple minutes they're like, oh, okay, I think I figured it out, and then you can see it, you're like, you can see that change, you know, in the energy.
Yeah, some well-placed questions, helping guide them, describe it, really can help them open up to themselves and find their own way. One of my favorite quotes, and I'm going to butcher it, is listening correctly is the listening correctly listening correctly is one of the most meaningful things one human being can do for another. It's not correctly, but it's something like that. And I just love that. Yeah, if you can listen really well, and then with some guiding questions or curious questions, even tell me more. What does that mean to you? Why do you feel that makes this sense? Getting people to talk about it helps guide them, and you're just showing up for them just by being that listening ear.
Yeah, I mean, it's in all my learnings and practice, I would have to say that's been something that I've had to learn how to develop over many years, and then kind of reignite for myself, because sometimes you think you're good at something, but then when you really come to understand it and then vocalize it to other people and say like, be honest with me, am I good at listening? And people are like, no, you're not. You know, like a good friend or like a loved one will tell you like, you know, you need to work on these things. You know, and sometimes people are like, oh, like I've got that figured out, and then you realize like, oh no, you actually like kind of suck at it. You know what I mean? Because sometimes it's also what people think of what listening actually is, because not necessarily like, if I were to do this while you're talking, like I could be intently like listening, but to you I wouldn't be, because you need to have that reciprocal like eye contact and everything else. So there's a level in which you have to understand that listening is a reciprocal relationship thing. It's not something that you think you may be doing by yourself. you know. So it's a process of understanding of the relationship and also the divide in communication, you know. So I've had to
active
touch on
listening
that. Active
is not just a passive sport.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why the quote is listening when done correctly
Mm-hmm.
is one of the most impactful things one human being can do for another.
Yeah.
Because when done correctly means active listening, and it's not just sitting and getting it, looking away. It's the eye contact. It's the affirmation, the validation. Okay, I'm hearing you, or the tell me more. I don't think I quite understand that.
Mm-hmm.
That is such an important part of that active listening.
I think these days too, like for so much conversation that I have with people, sometimes I get nervous when someone's actually listening to me, because like 90% of the time in most conversations that I have with people, they're just wanting to like download or process the information that I'm giving to them.
Mm-hmm.
And when I come across very few people like yourself that do it, I'm like, oh my God, this, like, I have that voice in the back of my head where they're like, oh my God, this person's actually listening to me.
Say something.
Yeah. And then you start like really thinking about what you're actually saying. And then you're like, oh God, was that right, wrong, and different or whatever? But I think that these days people, the intention a lot of times like really isn't there. It's more so just like a download of like everything these days, like instantaneous, like I'm getting what I needed, this situational process, and then I'm like moving on to the next thing. And I think a lot of it is also trying to be more in the moment of like the intentional listening with people, and I don't find that very often, you know. More so not necessarily in this society, because I've done a lot of travels, and I've noticed that especially like around the United States, people haven't learned that in school. It's not like you don't go to a class when you're younger and you're like, okay class, today we're going to learn how to listen, you know what I mean? Like just those simple things, you know, like something I try and do with my daughter every once in a while is I'll just go outside or inside and we'll just sit and just like, let's just sit, let's not talk, whatever. And then in like 10 minutes, you can tell me what you're listening to, like what's going on around you, and then what,
I love that.
You know, what did you hear? What did you observe? What's going on? And sometimes she'll point out things where like I didn't even take awareness of, and that's the beautiful thing about it, because she'll like, oh Dad, did you hear that? And you like your awareness didn't pick up on that, but then the second she put it into like your peripheral view or your hearing, you're like, oh wow, I do hear that. And then it's amazing, you know, because like we can only filter so much,
right?
You know, so like sometimes when people are like, you know, put that little pin drop of like extra information, and you realize there's so much more going on, you know, but until you have that, you don't know. Yeah.
I love that that you do that, because take her out for 10 minutes and there's no stimulus like a screen, and you get to detox a little bit, you adjust to it, and then like you're saying, people hear and observe different things. There's so much that we don't process that doesn't make it past our reticular activating system, and so it exists but we don't know it. I was watching this documentary on how the brain works recently, and I was fascinated to find out that visually we feel like we see everything very clearly. It's clear, I can understand what I'm looking at, but approximately 99% of what I'm actually looking at is blurry to my brain, and I just take little pictures, so you can only focus on about 1%, which is your thumbnail at arm's distance. That's all you can actually see clearly. And what your brain does is you take 6, 7, 8, 9 snapshots of that, and then your brain fills in the rest. And I thought, there's no way this is true.
Yeah, absolutely true.
And then they showed this eye tracking camera that would first reading text, and us watching on the screen, we can see the whole thing is X's except where the reader is looking, and as they're looking at it, it turns into letters. So this woman that's doing this is reading a passage, and all we see is X's, and then just these certain words being revealed as she looks at them. To her, it looks completely normal. And so that was one demonstration of it. The second demonstration was a very blurry picture, and then wherever she looked would become clear. And to her, it just looked very normal, but to us, it was hard to look at. It kind of hurt your eyes to focus because it was so bad. but to her it looked completely normal. And then they did the inverse of that, that wherever she looked was blocked, and she couldn't see anything because just where she was looking, everything else was completely blurred out. And the interviewer, the guy who's discussing this, says the world out there's real. You've just never been there.
Yeah.
Or the reality is all around us, but you've never been there. Our little sacks of neurons and stuff like that perceive approximately 1%, have our own reality because we're only getting 1%, and then everything else is made up a mixture of what we expect to see, what we hope to see, and what we actually see, and it's some mixture of that. But what you're doing is you're taking Ireland out there and saying, all right, we're going to eliminate the stimulus, and we're going to listen, and we're going to have different experiences, but then we're going to draw attention to certain things to each other, and discover each other's reality.
Yeah,
I think that's cool.
Oh, I think it's a beautiful thing. I think just the fact that we live in our own universes, like, we need to draw more attention to that, because I feel we try and think a lot of times that we're all so like we're all such a conglomerate of like a human species, and like because you live in this society, you're all the same in this way, but like all our realities are so completely different. And I think we need to make sure that, you know, evolving and understanding each of us as an individual and our perspectives gives so much more beauty and enlightenment to understand that like your perspective on this is so different than mine, and but that's okay, you know, and that's.
They might both be real.
And they might both be real. And I watched a demonstration on something like that recently too, but kind of different. But they were they were examining the fact that there are a bunch of people chanting something, and you're like, oh, what does this sound like? And like 90% of the crowd were like, oh, they're chanting da 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 da, right? But you couldn't really hear it clearly. So then what they did was, oh, well, does it sound like this? And then they wrote out a sentence, and they're like, oh, that's what it sounds like, right? And then they were like, are you sure about that? Here's another sentence. And then people were like, oh, actually, it's actually that one. And then they went through like 10. And then by the 10th one, people were like, I have no idea what they're chanting anymore. And they're like, okay, so like now we're going to like bring the voices together, and like this is what they're actually chanting. You know what I mean? And it spelled it out for the people. But the thing is, like, by the end, like when you actually took, you know, like a diagram of like the people in the crowd of who thought, well, it was so broken up, where everybody at the beginning was like, oh, this is what it is, because they all looked at each other like, this is what it is it? And then by the end, like everybody's like, I think it's this one, you know what I mean? And then by the end, it was like everybody came together again, and it was like, oh, this is actually like what they're chanting, you know. But the whole thing was, it was the linkage between like what you're actually hearing, then physically seeing it as a sentence. You know, because like you were saying, you're putting those puzzle pieces together by, oh, now that I see this in words, like it almost put more definition on what you're actually hearing.
That's the hope to part.
That's the hope to, yeah.
Or the expect to. This is what I expect to see, and so or hear. This is what I'm hearing because I expect to.
And I did the same thing too. When I was watching it, it was kind of one of those experimental things where like you're joining the group of people in the experiment, and so the first line was, oh yeah, that's what they're chanting, right? But then you're like, at the end, you're like, oh my god, that's what they're actually, you know, chanting, and it's like, man, it's like.
Yeah, and I think the application of all this is, we live in a society that's so quick to defend and jump to a position without entertaining and understanding why somebody else hears something different. And Marshall Rosenberg, he founded compassionate communication. No, excuse me, it's nonviolent communication, but now people oftentimes call it compassionate communication. But his theory, and he was called in to negotiate peace all over the world at different times. And his big thing was...
Okay, I found this on the web for who wanted to negotiate.
His big thing is really seek to understand what is it that the other person is experiencing, and what are they wanting. And once you can hear that, and they know that you've heard that, suddenly that opens them up to, or hopefully it usually will open them up to hearing your own experience. And if you can go in to try and understand, I don't see it this way, but they seem to. Let me see if I can try and figure out why they are hearing it chanted this way. even though I hear it this way, and by maintaining that openness, you can get people who view things very differently to sit down and have peaceful talks. And maybe they still hear or see it differently after the end, but they can see each other's point of view. They can see each other as humans. We lack that in society a lot of times right now, where we're so quick to say, oh, you're Republican, you're Democrat, you're conservative, you're liberal, whatever, and we don't want to hear anything beyond that and say, well, why is it you feel this way about the sanctity of life, or why is it you feel this way about the importance of choice, or whatever it is. We all really want good things, and I think we agree more than on the foundational principles more than people realize, even on things as diverse and divisive as sanctity of life and right to choose.
Mm-hmm. Do you use some of those teachings or that like foundational understandings when you go to these different places and get to speak your perspective on what it is or how you'd like to approach things, or how does that work in those settings for you?
That's a fascinating question. Let me think about that.
Okay.
So when I'm doing my day-to-day job, I do sales, and I think there is quite a bit of listening, and I would say that I seek to understand what is the problem that somebody's dealing with, and I genuinely want to help out. Even if that's not my product, I will want to help somebody out.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the real desire to understand helps me be better at my job, because then people know they can trust me.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe you were asking more like when I go speak on our book. Don't really address those principles, but that's a fascinating one.
Mm-hmm.
So the first book, My Friends That Are Not Rewriting Your Negative Self-Talk Script, is really around self-talk and how do we respond, or habits of responding to our situations and the thoughts that we have about ourselves relative to life's experiences. But some of the other books that we've got in mind, the follow-ups, will certainly address a little bit more of that.
Where are you right now with potentially writing another book?
So book number 2 is called My Anxiety Escalator's Out of Control.
Mm-hmm.
It is in a near final draft state, but it's been there for about a year and a half. I embarked on this with Isley to help her learn, to just have an experience, to teach her about business, using this as a vehicle. She's lost interest. Maybe I should say it differently. She's 15.
Mm-hmm.
She's more interested in
That's
sports
a good way
and
of
her friends.
rephrasing it.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's probably right for her age. She should be engaging in those things, and because she's not driving it and not participating, it became more of my thing.
Mm-hmm.
And while I still love it and I still work on these things from time to time, it's not my day job, and it pulls me away from being a father. And so it's a hobby that I treat it as a hobby that I fill time with. Or I do when I have.
So it's fallen back as a passionate hobby.
Passionate hobby that comes after being a dad, after being a husband, after being a provider, after exercising for myself, after service that I feel is meaningful. All those things take priority.
Yeah.
And so that's why it is where it is. But I'm excited about it. What the idea is, I've experienced panic and anxiety, and it's uncomfortable. We'll start there. And sometimes it can surprise you, and it feels like it came out of nowhere. But mindfulness, it's a word that may have lost its meaning for some people, because they hear mindfulness and they go, okay, I'm going to be mindful about this. But the practice of it is lost in the cliche word. Excuse me. What the book does, My Anxiety Escalator's Out of Control, it follows a boy, actually it might be a girl, we don't know yet, who's walking to school with mom and suddenly finds himself on his escalator above the city skyline, panic-stricken, holding on to the rail, and doesn't know how they got there. And this keeps happening, just random times. And it's uncomfortable and scary for them, and then they start to recognize, or the turning point is, or we'll say Ava, because it's either going to be Ava or Walter. Ava is sitting in class and they're going over a fire escape plan, like a fire drill at school, and the teacher explains, with the fire drill, we don't have to panic. We prepare for that. We just plan ahead what we're going to do when we smell smoke, hear a warning of some kind, and then we have a plan for escaping it. And so Ava says, well, maybe I can solve this problem myself rather than trying to rely on other people to help me down from this anxiety. I'm going to learn to start recognize the early warning signs like smoke and heat as to fire. What are the early warning signs for me? And she starts, and we have this menu of things that are typical, and she starts experimenting with it. Well, maybe my jaw's clenched, or maybe my hands and I'm starting to sweat, or I get racing thoughts, or for a lot of younger kids, all they recognize is their stomach hurts. But some kind of sign. And mindfulness is being aware of those things. And then she pairs this with a list of evidence-based or research-based things that we're trying to compile a menu, and start saying, okay, well, if I notice my racing thoughts, here's what I'm going to try, and starts pairing and building an escape plan, basically, just like an evacuation out of a building, a fire escape. I'm going to take this route. If I smell smell smoke, I'm going to build this plan so that I know if this, then that. If I catch myself clenching my jaw, I know that I need to wiggle and loosen up, or look up. By looking up, you engage part of the medulla oblongata, and it helps release some of that pressure that's building up. So they, in the book, they'll build their own plan. So that's the next book. We've got a few others.
It's great. I mean, I think it's wonderful that you're doing that, because I even see, so much of what I've tried to research as far as CPTSD, which I have, and I've had for a very long time, from like an early, very traumatic childhood, and then growing up and having like a lot of pretty horrific experiences in my early adulthood, and then leading up to now, and then not really like recognizing it, and then having experiences of like constant trauma and breakdowns, and wondering like where it's all coming from, and having panic attacks that will sometimes last for like 5 hours, and stuff like that, and then trying to look it up, and seeing how to deal with it. And there's really not much out there. There's PTSD, and you can look up like some tools of like recognition, and like you're saying, how to like go about it. But for me, like, I think a lot of the way people approach it is like escapism, and I don't always feel like that's the best way to.
It's a Band-Aid.
Yeah, like they're all, like, a lot of times people are like, oh, you need to take this, or you need to do this, and it's always like pushing it aside. And for me, like, one of the best ways that helped me is actually do the opposite. I need to lean into it. Like, I need to like recognize it, that I'm about to have a panic attack, or I'm in the midst of it, or I'm on the very cusp of starting one, and then like understanding like this is happening, like I can feel it in my body, like I have to still do my job and do what I need to because I'm talking to somebody or something like that, but I need to lean into it and understand that like I need to breathe through it, and I need to be aware and conscious of it, and find the right tactics that work for me as a person, as opposed to like, oh, let's just set this aside and deal with it this evening kind of thing. I think a lot of what I've found in the tools for that, whether it be a child, because I know that as a child I was having those experiences, but I didn't know what they were at the time. So a lot of it was just distancing myself from that, and it became, like eating, or like passivity,
Learned helplessness.
Helplessness, and those types of things. And so it took me a long time to like recognize it, but even by then I was like, my latter part of my teens, and even at that time, 15, 20 years ago, there wasn't even much information on it regardless. And now they're starting to understand that like CPTSD is like recognized as leading to ADHD and all these different things, with like adulthood and people having different types of issues.
Yeah.
But I think that it's great for kids to start to understand those things at an earlier age, because they can recognize and start to make the right steps. If they did have trauma or did have an experience that like really resonated with them and it's affecting them, to learn how to take the right steps and finding the I like the idea of what you're saying is like a fire drill, but also finding what works for them as an individual. Because once again, we were just talking about the fact that we're all so unique. It's like you can use that concept, but then filling in the blanks with what you feel is best for yourself, and understanding like a fire drill, you need to do certain things, but it's not necessarily like a fire drill. You don't have to go under the table when you have a panic attack, but you find out what's going to bring you that safety, like going under the table, what's going to bring you back to like homeostasis for yourself, to realize that like you're okay. You're not going to die right now. This isn't you having a heart attack, though it may feel like it. Sometimes that's not going to happen. But what do you need to do to get past that, to take the next stage in recognition that things are going to be all right? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So, for the listeners, sometimes distraction is the right response. Distract yourself and let the physiological aspects cool off. But leaning into it is also the right response, probably more often than not, so that you can actually start addressing it. And I think sometimes what that's called, what you're describing, is ERP, or exposure response prevention, where you get exposed to maybe a smaller dose of it. I often use the example of a snake. If somebody is terrified of and has a phobia of snakes, ERP in that situation might be they look at a picture of a snake, and the response, they work on not responding to it, not having the panic attack, and prevent that response. And then maybe they see a snake in an aquarium where they are distanced and they're safe, and work on not having a response to that. And then seeing somebody else handle the snake, and by doing that, they can slowly work towards having no response, no panic response to whatever that is. That was the trigger for them. And so that's what I'm really trying to manufacture for my daughters. They have some social phobias. Phobias might be a little bit too strong, but if I speak too loud at a restaurant, they get so nervous and uncomfortable, like, oh, we're going to upset other people. And we're not talking like being loud. I'm not a loud person.
Yeah.
And so what I've started to do when they respond like that is I'll go talk to people nearby as we're walking in, like, hey, that looks really good. How is that? Would you recommend it? Simple little benign questions like that, and they just are mortified and freak out. But I show them a lot of times, more often than not, these people end up chatting. We have a good, quick conversation, and it's a positive experience because I want them to start getting that little doses of exposure to interacting with strangers and seeing that, hey, this is okay. The world is full of friends I haven't met yet.
Yeah, that's great.
And then getting them to try and do it. I'll sometimes give them challenges, missions, like, hey, smile at 3 strangers today. See if you can get them to smile back.
Yeah.
Little bite-sized tasks that they can accomplish.
Yeah, I like those little bite-sized things, because obviously they're like little stepping stones to try and figure out what it is internally that you're struggling with, and sometimes I feel like with those little like markers of development, it's not always trying to focus so much intentionally on solving the issue. I feel like the unconscious a lot of times can solve that for you, but you need to take those little steps so that it can do what it needs to. Like sometimes I've come to understand that like some of my issues personally, like I don't always need to throw the dart and it needs to land exactly where it needs to. It's more so like setting the intention within myself so that like I recognize what I need to do and I see the goal, but I let my unconscious do the figuring out for me so that I can sit down and meditate on that, but then not put focus on it. You know what I'm saying? I just allow it to just kind of go to the wayside so that sometimes more energy can be directed to that specific location, because sometimes the way in which we approach things is so laser focused that sometimes that like little laser is only hitting a little plot on this bigger picture. You know what I mean? So sometimes like not the letting go of the laser focus can hit way more of a broad spectrum than what you think you're trying to figure out.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think so. Have you found any practices or tools that are especially impactful as you try and do that?
Yes. So let's see. A lot of times, many times, to this current day, I still have panic attacks, but I don't know where they come from, right? I always I've been trying to figure out for so long, like, oh, like it's got to be this, so it's got to be that, like it was this experience, or is that, like, that's led to why I'm having this experience now. And I think that the way I've been able to heal myself is by the letting go of the concept of placing recognition on things, because I think that sometimes, though we think our brain, like, and this is almost kind of a cyclical process back around to like the whole like brain. Our brain, to me, I feel like is just a giant like funnel system, right? It's not even necessarily like that we give so much attention like, oh, our brain's doing all of this, right? I feel like it's more of just like breaking down so much information so that we can conceptually understand just a little fraction of like what's going on. So I think a lot of times when I conceptually visualize it like that, I understand that I'm placing so much focus on like all this information and it's being funneled down to what I'm actually capable of handling. Like, why not allow myself to know that the reality of all information in the full spectrum of all things is so much. I almost give it back to God to say like, I allow this energy to be given back so that I can understand fully of what's taking place, so that I can allow my body to heal in this process. And I don't know if that makes exact sense, and I can try and like clarify that in other words, but I think it's just, like I said before, a lot of it's just intention, because for the longest time I tried to like pinpoint it, right? And it was only until I allowed it to just be, until I started feeling the healing process. But it took a lot of work to do that as well. People always think like, oh, you just thought like this and you just gave it away or whatever. It's like, no, in that whole process, it took a lot of work to get to that point, to allow myself to find the release in the process so that I could heal, rather than just be like, oh, one thought, like I'm done, I'm free from it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
There are a couple things that I really like that you said that I kind of keyed in on. Attention and focus. You talk about laser focus. I think it's Jay Shetty says, where your attention goes, energy flows. And there's a lot of value in that. And you talked about turning it over to a higher power. And some of the things that you were saying reminded me of parts therapy. I think it's called parts therapy, where you recognize and you're kind of self-compassionate towards yourself. You see that there's a little boy or a little girl inside you who's stopped at some point in their development because of some of these childhood traumas and these instances that they had, and they haven't developed beyond it. And by showing up as the caring adult and loving them and accepting it and turning it over to God, you're not holding onto it so tightly anymore, and you can release that.
I think we do that so much in so many different dynamics of who we are, because we'll stop at a certain point because like we either feel like we've developed enough and we're like, I'm good.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I don't need to go any further than this. I've like figured it all out. Or, like emotionally, spiritually, like, I feel like the second we start to define ourselves as being like good or complete is when we lose all traction of like the fact that everything is an endless, vast experience of like always recreation and unknowingness of things that we just need to tap into all the time. Because I honestly feel like every day I wake up, I'm a different person. So I don't like to define myself as yesterday, because then I'm not giving myself the true meaning of what I actually am, because then I'm not growing as a person. And the second I think that like, oh, I'm good, yesterday I figured it out and I'm good, and like my wife was happy with me because I did the dishes, and then I know from that day on that I needed to do that like once a week or something like that, because that's how I'm going to make her happy. It's like, then you've limited yourself on like so many possibilities of what you think you've figured out, you know. And I think I really believe that, you know, we have to open ourselves up to allow that just growing and compassion, like you said, for ourselves to take place, because there's so much healing in that, you know. And it takes a lot of work, and it's defining that for yourself, because it's not something that you can necessarily read through a book, though you can understand different tools and different metaphors defined as, like, you know, the fire drill, which is super helpful, because I wish that at a young age I found books like that, though I found certain books that did like a roundabout of unintentionally explaining things, which I used. There wasn't anything very specific to that, you know. So I think for kids these days, in so much more different types of trauma that they experience, and I've seen it like with my own daughter, even being 9 years old and living up to expectations of people on like the internet. Like, I see like the trauma that she's already experiencing, where she's like, Dad, I'm not good enough because look at this girl. And I'm like, oh my God, like at 9 years old, like I was at the beach, like I don't give a fuck about anything, you know. Yeah. But she's already like getting so homed in on that, and then being like, Dad, am I good enough? And I'm like, oh my gosh.
So that,
you know?
is, I think, our most important role as a father for daughters, is to assure them that they are good as they are, they're loved, they're beautiful, and over again say that to them, because kids don't believe truth about themselves. It's very clear, the research is very clear, they believe what they hear most often. And if their thoughts, which it's always going to be their thoughts that they hear most often, but if their thoughts are, I don't look like that girl, I don't have the same hair or the body or the skin or whatever it is, that's what they hear and that's what they reinforce. And so we've got to try and help them interrupt that. That is actually one of the other books we're working on. And that's probably a quarter of the way done. It's called Joy and the Happiness Thief. I had read a study. It was, at the time, it was the longest and the only long-term longitudinal study on the effects of social media usage on adolescent girls. BYU, Brigham Young University, did this study. They followed girls from, I think it was 14 to 24, 12 to 22, something like that. And it is damaging.
Oh, it's terrifying.
There are ways to engage with it that aren't as bad, but observing and doing what they call lurking, where you're not engaging with your friends, but you're just kind of observing and scrolling through and looking at their lives, their pictures, their highlights that they're putting out there. This was awesome, check it out. And then we just assume, our brain fills in, that's how every day is for them. Every aspect of their life must be roses. And then by comparison, my life doesn't look like that. I don't feel like that. I'm not as happy as she looks. Something's wrong with me, something's wrong with my life, and really make ourselves depressed and unhappy. And in the book Joy and the Happiness Thief, do you mind if I take a second and explain what the idea is?
Yeah, that's what we're here to do.
This girl Joy so the whole book, you just see the back of her head and the mirror she's looking into, and you're hearing her thoughts. And the first couple pages I've got written down, like it's her journal, so you kind of get to know her, how she thinks about herself, how she feels about herself. But then as she uses social media, she starts thinking things like, wow, my hair is really gross, or it's poofy, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And you can still see the girl looks the same, but the reflection that she's seeing back, suddenly it has big hair, or her eyebrows are really big, her skin's really pimply, oh, she's fat. The girl hasn't changed at all, but her perspective and her reflection has changed.
That's powerful.
And
I love it.
And then the turning point is when she realizes she needs to stop doing that lurking and that comparison, and limit it and take drastic steps. Sometimes it's deleting it. I had to delete Facebook recently.
I did that like a year and a half ago, at least.
I go through cycles where I have it because I want to use it to message or check out something, and then I'm done.
Yep.
But she goes to this turning point and has to really become reacquainted with herself and accept herself and do the work of learning to love herself. And then she starts seeing things herself as she is again. But it's only after shutting off that paying attention to others in comparison. And so that's Joy is the girl, and the happiness thief is these behaviors that become so natural on social media, where you're trying to get the likes. You're putting yourself out there,
Yep.
and you're addicted to the assurance of so many people liked love my picture, my status update.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that. I mean, so I would gravitate to stuff like that, even though it didn't exist when I was like 14. But like where I was starting to experience stuff like that, she's doing that like 8.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm like, oh my god, like it's 10-year gap within like a 30-year experience, you know, has changed that rapidly within our society is shocking. And it obviously, like, we have to, as fathers, keep up with those experiences. But I also feel like society needs to keep pace with that. And that's the thing that we're lacking within our educational system. Why people like you are so necessary, you know, in developing this stuff, because we're not keeping pace. It's exponentially moving so rapidly, while the education system and so much is trying to keep up with it. There's not enough money trying to get even ahead of it to say like, oh, this is what we need to do to rectify this, or this is what we need. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just this constant like trying to keep up. And of course, as parents, we need to make sure that we're much more aware of it, and that we try and solve some of those issues. But at the same time, we need to make sure, like, because we know that our education system, you know, in the United States sucks, that we need to, as parents, make sure that we keep up and foresee these changes, because it's like literally what I see within the economy and social media, every month it's changing. It's like, it's so fast these days that we need to see what they're watching. We need to like ask them, hey, do you have any questions about what you're watching or what you see, or if you're feeling bad about stuff, you know, because I've had to have conversations where I'm like, you know, I have had to reaffirm that these people are being helped by a group of people, like, because their concept is like, oh, this person created this and it's just them and they're so amazing.
Yeah.
You know, so they don't understand the broad spectrum of like people that are helping develop these things. And I'm like, you know how much money, time, and effort, and probably like 20 different people are figuring this out? It's not just some little girl developing this. You know, like, you're doing this by yourself. You're doing amazing. You know what I mean? So like from their point of view, they don't understand so much of what's going on, and we as parents are the only ones on the forefront to keep ahead of these things, and then to provide them with books like you're transcripting, to say like, hey, look, let's read this book tonight and then we'll talk about it, because it's so necessary to try and fundamentally implement certain aspects, so that, like we were talking about before, when they run into it, at least they have some context to try and figure it out themselves, some tools to figure it out, because otherwise there's just nothing out there. Like there's tools for older things, right, that we might have run into, which is like, you know, a stupid drug commercial on TV where it's like, don't do drugs, kids, it's bad for you. This is your brain on drugs. That's what we got. And then these days we don't have commercials anymore, first of all, you know, so like kids aren't seeing anything like that. And then second of all, they don't have any other reference to say like, oh, there's not something at the end of the post that says like, oh, and by the way, thank you to all my 50 people like who helped me develop this. You know what I mean? And this video cost me $1 million. You know, thank you so much. Like, so there's nothing there for reference for these kids to understand. Yeah. You know, so that's the scary part too. It's like, what else do you do?
It's skewed reality.
Mm-hmm.
And taking a kind of a turn in the conversation, but bringing it will come around. The cruel irony and the crazy paradox about social media is that you'd think we'd be more connected than ever.
Mm-hmm.
But a survey of, I'm trying to remember the dates, and I'm not going to get it right, but we'll say it was about 20 years ago, the number of people that, when surveyed and asked, how many people do you think you could call on an emergency? Somebody, if you were in a crisis, you could call. The average number for Americans was around 5. This was 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
In 2018, it was less than 1. It was close to 0. It would rounding down. It would round to 0.
Mm-hmm.
It was so close that people feel disconnected, and the problems, our brains are so hardwired for connection that it causes so many mental distresses and issues, and it's not a good substitute. It's social media is not a good substitute for human connectedness, and it's an empty carb. It's an empty sugar. We're getting no psychological nutrition from these relationships in it online, or 5,000 friends on our account, and so people are plagued and, I would say, dying of loneliness. One study I read said that loneliness is as damaging to your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yep.
And so, where I think our schools are doing the best they can, they've had so many things. I saw this list once of all the different things that have been added to what they have to teach and the amount of time they have, minutes for this and that. It's really kind of moot point. It's hard to teach somebody when they're in a mental state of distress, that they don't feel connected to people. And I think that is, I'm going to go out on pontificating on my own thoughts, but I think that contributes a lot to the problems that we're seeing with gun violence. And so one of the goals that we had with our books, and then we started working on an app, don't know if this will ever happen, but to really try and identify that a teacher could use to identify students who are isolated, socially isolated, by asking pulse checks, little questions, things like a seating chart. Who would you like to sit next to? Give me 4 kids you'd like to sit next to, and I'll try and in next week, and I'll try and make it happen. And then what the teacher would be able to see is, okay, who's not getting requested, and try and pair that kid up with another kid. The goal being, let's try and break down these walls, get kids talking to each other, build relationships so nobody's feeling so isolated that they hurt so much that they would go hurt other people, like shooting up at school. And so that took
no, it's fine. It makes sense. Yeah,
quite a detour. But the fact that we are so connected yet so lonely is tragic.
Yeah, I like the metaphor for the empty carb. Did you want something else to drink? You good?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, it's man, the connection theory of what's happening right now. It's just, I mean, that's why one of the reasons we moved up here is because we wanted just more connection with like neighborhood, family and friends and people close by us, because I think it's like so important and we see the value of it. But we also grew up in a generation where every single day I would wake up to a group of kids going to the beach. Like TV would be something that you maybe watch like 10 minutes in the morning before you go to school. Yeah. You know, and
eating your cereal, watching Transformers.
Exactly. Something along those lines, and it's just changed obviously so much these days to say like, oh, this person's my friend or that person's not my friend. Like to me, it's all just hogwash. You know, I've realized like the value of it even for myself, like with Facebook or things like that it holds no value to me because I grew up with authenticity and what it actually meant. So then when I try and feed myself those empty carbs, like you're saying, I recognize it and it's not feeding me. Like, because I've also understood like the value of what I'm feeding myself, not only through like recognition of like the internet, but also things around me in everyday life, not just what I'm consuming internally, but visually with these things. I'm less like, man, this doesn't give me anything. You know, it holds no value to me because there's nothing really there unless I'm trying to, like you said, connect with somebody, which I think is important. But other than that, it's just like, what's the point? You know, and it's like trying to teach that too is like so difficult because through COVID and all these other things of people, you know, squashing the idea of connection, it's been even more difficult because even moving up here, we've noticed that moving up here after COVID and trying to get our daughter to go to certain people's houses, there's a lot of like what we've found, what's the word, where you have to go through like a recognition process or like some type of like
warming up,
it's like, okay, they have to come over to make sure that like you're not creeps, which is always important. Like I get that aspect, but then it's like you're like you're healthy, Like you're not like you're not weirdos. You take care of each other, kind of thing. Like you're not sick people or something along. And then it's like then you can see my child, and then like we can go to the park. But even then, it's like another step in like getting to know somebody. You know?
How often are the parents involved driving that? It's
always
involved.
Always,
yeah.
Yep.
And when we were kids, we would just go out and play.
Go. Didn't matter.
Didn't see
One lick.
mom or dad.
Yep.
Until
I didn't even know some people's parents until like I went over to the house. I'm like, oh hey, nice to meet you,
right,
kind of thing, you know. So it's so different.
So by having our kids distanced socially during COVID, but also just the society. I mean, would you let your daughter walk to school on her own?
Not right now, but I feel comfortable enough in this neighborhood that yes, when I get to that point, which is very soon, I will allow that.
Good. I think obviously school is really close to us.
Yes, it's different for most people, but we're 2.5 blocks away. So
yeah, but the problem with not just allowing our kids to go out is twofold at least. I don't think they have the connections if we have to be involved with their play dates and setting them up and driving them places. They're not going to get as many of them. Like we were just out riding bikes all day long. Mm-hmm. They're not going to get as much time. The second thing is they're not going to experience opportunities to struggle. Mm-hmm. We'd have the bike chain fall off, and 8, 9 years old, we'd be like, well, I'll figure this out.
Yeah.
And we'd have to self-soothe isn't the right word, but to figure things out. And we learned that we could do things that way through struggle and figuring stuff out. Mm-hmm. That is something that I got, I think, because of that, and it's really hard to try and get my kids to do things that they don't know how to do, mm-hmm. and just figure it out. I have this mindset that I can, and to a fault, that I can do anything. Like, oh yeah, I'll do that. Mm-hmm. And taking our kitchen, for example, did all the demo, kept going all the way down to the studs, pulled out the ceiling, I moved some electrical, moved some plumbing. I have no business doing any of that. Yeah. But I just feel like, I can figure it out. Mm-hmm. I can't get my kids to do anything that they don't feel already confident in doing. And I think that that's just a plague of not having that self-efficacy taught through. I'm at the park, I'm a mile from my house, mm-hmm. my bike chain just fell off or whatever my problem is, and learning how to deal with it in stages, a gradual release of oh crap moments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I grew up with that. My parents were very like. Sometimes when I look back, I almost wish I was like, man, I wish my parents were more like controlling to a certain extent, because they were like the opposite in a lot of ways. Yeah. Like I would come home in the evening and they either wouldn't be there, they'd gone to a movie or something like that, and they were just like, they had no care about what I was up to, and I'd come home, I'd be like, God, I wish my parents kind of cared where I was, but
at home alone.
Yeah, but at the same time, like I loved the freedom, and as I got older, I realized the value of the balance, the yin and yang of that.
It's a balance.
Yeah, it's a super balance to learn as a parent, and figuring out what that is as an individual for each kid, and recognizing who they are as a person and as a soul, and knowing that they're already instilled with certain values and different things that they brought with them. So you have to recognize that, which I have with my daughter. But at the same time, I have also tried to instill her with certain things of like situational awareness. Like if something goes wrong, what do you do? Like if this light's on fire, what are you gonna do? Like you don't just run out of the house, or maybe you do run out of the house. Like what is your reaction to this? But at the same time, it's we're plagued with a lot of like mind viruses like from society. But at the same time, you see that kids are even instilled with fear from their parents. Yeah. So it's like the kids are like scary. Always looking to mom or dad, like in understanding what they can and cannot do. And I've seen that so many times with kids where they're like doing something and they'll like look at mom and like, is this okay? Kind of thing. And I was like, shit, I never had to do that. So like I was in that moment where they're looking to them to like, for the parent to look, this kind of thing. I never had that. So I had to conceptual or like figure out within myself, like, oh, this is right or wrong, or I shouldn't do this, or like if I'm in a bad situation, this is what I need to do to get out of it, you know?
Yeah.
So I think there was a lot of different wiring that we had to do to process things, and nowadays it's like, shit, like it's just, it's scary.
It takes a parent going out of their way to make sure they give their kids those experiences, and I try to do that. For example, I'm trying to get my kids to make their own medical appointments and dentist appointments and things like that, so that they know how to call people. I had the experience of 18, 19, living in Europe. I broke a molar. I bit something down, broke a molar, my tooth was bleeding. And for 3 days, I just kind of let it go. It kept bleeding. I didn't know how to make my own dentist appointment. I was very intimidated by the phone, and I don't want my girls to experience that. Another example is when we fly someplace, I always make them try and navigate. Like, all right, get us to the hotel shuttle, or get us to the baggage claim, and then to get an Uber. I want them to figure it out. I'm there, but I follow them, and it's really funny to watch them struggle to follow the signs or to ask for help. They don't like asking for help, but I need them to know how to do this.
It's important.
So that at 18, 19, 20, they are ready to go. They're on the world on their own.
Yeah. It's funny. I don't know why, like, out of all the things you just said, I remember a moment when I was like 15 years old. My parents were redoing their roof at that time. And I was walking home, and I was walking up the steps, and like 90% of the time I was barefoot, and I stepped on a roofing nail. And I don't know if you know what a roofing nail is. It's like it's like this long. They're pretty long, and it actually went through my foot, and it was on the top part of my foot. It was poking through, but the skin was still holding, so I could see the nail like wanting to pierce through, and so. Like, my parents were home, and I didn't have a cell phone, so I couldn't exactly call my parents, you know? And so, like, in those 10 minutes of sitting there in agony, I had to think about, like, okay, like, how am I going to figure this out? Because I'm not going to, like, I'm not going to hobble to my neighbors. Like, I can't really hobble right now. I need to figure something out. So, like, in that...
So what you do?
So in that situational awareness, like, I went to the bathtub, I pulled the nail out, and I got like a bottle of like peroxide, and I put it in a certain container. I was able to flush it out, you know, and because like if there's any metal particles or anything in there, because I had an idea of what I had to do for myself in that moment, right? And it was, I remember, like, I guess why I remember that, because it was a horrible experience, but I was able to figure it out because there was no other.
And the self-efficacy you gained through that was quite a gift.
Yeah, and it I guess that carried through to many other experiences that I've had where I've injured myself and had to figure it out. You know what I mean? Because like many years later, obviously there was a cell phone, you can make that call, and I was fortunate enough to live in a family that had enough money to where I had the second pagers came out, like I had a pager. The second phones came out, I had a phone. So I was blessed to have that, but
you carried them around in your fanny pack?
Yeah, exactly. I never had a fanny pack, but I've had many experiences like that where I think that's carried through. I'm like, okay, I'm hurt. What do I need to do for myself? Like, and then also being like, how bad is it? Do I need to go to the hospital? Do I need to make the phone call? Or do I need
assess the situation?
Like I said, like break it down and be like, am I going to die in this moment? Okay, I'm not going to die. So what do I need to do? Like, do I need stitches? Do I need to like figure this out for myself? And just having those moments, you know, I've seen my daughter react to certain situational things where it's just like, oh, and that's like deer in the headlights, and I'm like, oh, that's the last thing you need to do, because that's not going to get you anywhere.
Right.
And I've seen it with other people too, like in just moments of terror and full breakdown of, you know, not knowing what to do whatsoever. And I was like, man, like the first thing that I've been able to do and teach myself is like, you're feeling like this, like stay right there, but then step outside of yourself so you can see yourself reacting, right? So you're like, oh, I'm terrified, or like I've hurt myself, or this situation, and then think clearly of what you need to do for yourself or other people around you.
Yeah.
But it's like, if you don't understand what it takes to do something like that, usually you're in a bad situation because you're so caught up in whatever it is that's happening to you. And I see it with so many other people and kids these days where I'm like, man, like, what happens if something really bad happens? You know, what if it's really bad? You know, like how many people are gonna flip out, not know what to do, and just like completely shut down, and that really worries me sometimes. And I've tried to take little steps here and there, those baby steps that we were talking about, where I've explained to Erilyn, if there's a really bad situation, you have a cell phone, right? And you try and call me. If that doesn't happen, we're fortunate enough, we live close by. You're going to need to get yourself home. Like, here's where the key is. Yeah. You're going to go into the house and you're going to literally wait there and lock the door until like someone comes home and things get figured out. But even those little steps to us when we were their age would have been like common sense.
They need to be taught explicitly.
Yes.
One of the products that we sell at work is built on some research from the United States Air Force done. It was a 10-year study on teaching critical thinking skills in stressful situations. And common sense goes out the window when stress turns on.
Yep.
And it really needs to be pre-thought through. How do I handle the situation? How do I assess what's the problem? What information am I given? What does an ideal solution look like? Or outcome look like, and what's the solution to get me to that best and safest outcome? And without opportunities to practice it, when that time comes, the oh crap moments, you're that deer in the headlights.
Yep.
And so teaching that process and manufacturing opportunities for our kids to do it will only help them for the future.
It's figuring out how to go about that too. Like, I can remember an instant, and like now that I think back on it, I don't know if it was like an insightful, blessed moment or just my dad being like a really terrible person. But I remember like there was one time, I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I'm sure I was like Erilyn's age or younger. And my dad was like, "What are you scared of?" And I was like, "Oh, the nighttime and like doing this." And he's like, "You know this route that goes like from your school to like our house?" And it was basically like a big loop. He's like, "You're going to go walk that." And I was like, "What?" I was like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like 8 years old or something. Like, I'm not gonna like. What if somebody
at midnight?
Yeah, no, it was at nighttime.
Yeah.
And I was like, "What if somebody like picks me up and runs off with me or something?" And he's like, "You're gonna go do this," and he made me go do that. And it was like, it was a horrifying experience, and I still remember it to this day because I was like, it was the first time, like at nighttime, I had to go. Like, I knew the route. But at nighttime, when you're a kid, or even sometimes as an adult, things look completely different.
Yeah.
So though I know I was going the right way and did it, like, he made me do it. And I remember, like, when I got to, like, the 75% marker, like, I ran the rest of the way home, But it was like, I look back and I'm like, was that a good thing or, like, not a good, you know what I mean? Like,
there's definitely a line, and I don't know that it's ever going to be exactly clear. That between trauma-inducing experiences and being pushed to do feared things and conquering that and feeling good, and it's hard to know where that is.
It's super hard. I mean, I've done it for myself because I can admit, like, I don't know what it is, but I'm very fearful of heights, and it's like I get I get this, like, even when I'm watching video or like movies where like somebody's jumping across a bridge I get this whole sensation in my body, like I'm falling, or like this experience, and it's referenced, and maybe I need to dive into this more, even with some panic that I have in some of the feeling that I have when I'm going into a panic attack. But the way that I've leaned into it is I've also gone skydiving because like I knew that it terrified me.
Yeah.
So I was like, conquer your, like, I'm a man. I'm gonna conquer this and figure out why the hell like it is that like I'm dealing with this. But the funny thing is, when I was on the plane looking down, I was like white as a ghost, sweating profusely, like almost blacking out, like like horrified. But the second I jumped, it was like such a relief, like over my entire body, knowing that like I had overcome that little fraction of a moment. And I think a lot of psychology that I've read like is intertwined with like death. That's what a lot of psychology, I've known some psychologists, and they say that's all it really is. Like, you're just this fear of death and the letting go and the overall experience. And I can understand that to a certain extent. I see the value in it. Does it help me in life in the now? Not necessarily, though I can see that maybe with some sessions it can get me there. But like, it really helped me understanding the tipping point of like, yes, I'm terrified, but when I jump, everything's okay. You know what I mean? And maybe that's a metaphor for life. But still to this day, even when I watch stuff on like my big screen TV, like in a Mission Impossible movie or something, like when he's going over, I'm just still like, I'm like, oh, I almost can't even look at that moment.
Next episode's happening at Trapeze High. It's a trapeze school in Escondido. We're doing.
I think I'm even sweating a little bit just talking about it right now. It's like, it freaks me out. But yeah, I don't know what it is like. Like defining that for ourselves, for our kids, and not being an ass in pressuring them to do those things because we see the value in it.
Yeah.
But it's like, do they see the value in it? And then it's also like, is that going to traumatize you later on in life by me making you like do those things? Also, is a terrifying thought. Yeah, is this right? But like the way I see it, and I hope that one day, like I can look back on it, like those thoughts will be coming from a good place. And though I hope that like with my dad, it was the same thing, though I know that there was a lot of other things that weren't, at least I can look back knowing that I personally, it was coming from a good intentional place. Yeah. And then my daughter at some point will also look back and be like, hey, dad messed up a lot of times, but he was heartfully in the right place trying to make these decisions for me.
When I'm making those decisions, I will often start with and talking to my girls, I'll start with the question, do you know that I love you?
Which is always
know that I want the best for you?
Yeah. And they're like, oh God, here it comes.
As long as they know that and can feel that, then I think I can keep pushing. And then the other thing I remind them often is being brave more often than not means doing it scared. And so it only takes a second of courage to put yourself out there, to get out of the plane, to say hi, to smile at that person, or compliment them, strike up that conversation, whatever the fear is, whatever you're trying to overcome. Sometimes it just takes a few seconds of courage to get going. And don't wait for there to be a lack of fear. That doesn't mean you're not brave once you have no more fear. You're brave when you move forward in spite of that fear.